So if you're being a good boy or girl or whatever and making use of private endpoints for your Azure services, first of all, good on you. But you might then have come across some challenges when it comes to resolving the DNS names for those private endpoints. If you only have a single VNet and use the defaults when going through the wizard to create a private endpoint, then you might not have come across this challenge because in that kind of a scenario, it just works, thanks to Azure Magic. In that kind of scenario, your VMs try to resolve the name of your service, for example, mystorage.blob.core.windows.net. The Azure Magic makes sure to know that this is a service that utilizes private endpoint and returns the private link address, which would be mystorage.privatelink.blob.core.windows.net. A new query is performed to look that up, and as it is listed in the DNS zone that is linked to your VNet, the private IP is returned, and thus you can connect directly to the private endpoint instead of going over public net. But if you have a proper hub and spoke setup, or you connect from an on-prem environment, then you lose out on that bit of Azure Magic. So you would need to go through a couple of hoops to get it all working. Now, from your on-prem environment, you could always go the MacGyver route and just manually hardcode the DNS names and point them to the private IP of the private endpoint, but please just don't. While it may work when you set it all up, it's just not a reliable way of doing things. The better way is to either set up a VM in Azure that you forward those DNS requests to, or even better, make use of the private resolver in Azure. So that is what we will be looking at today. I'll show you how it works, how to set it up, and also cover how you can really simply set up your own demo environment for this. So this will actually be kind of a video where you can follow along in your own demo environment as well. Sound good? Perfect. Let's get to it then. So to properly understand and appreciate the private resolver service, let us first take a look at how the recommended setup was before we had it. Because it's not that new of a service, it has been around for nearly a year now, but things were a bit harder before we had the private resolver service. If we take a look at this image here, this was the previously recommended setup for using private endpoints in conjunction with an on-premise network. It may seem complicated, but let us go through it step by step. So your client VM down on the right side here, it would try to resolve, in this case, the azsql1.database.windows.net. It sends that query over to its internal on-prem DNS server. That internal DNS server is configured with a conditional forwarder for database.windows.net. So it will forward the query to the IP address listed in its forwarded list. In this case, that will be 10.5.0.254, which is this VM hosted in Azure here. The VM in Azure receives the request and it forwards it again to the default Azure DNS server. And the Azure DNS server does a new lookup of azsql1.database.windows.net. It receives a CNAME record or alias in return that is for azsql1.privatelink.database.windows.net. The Azure DNS then looks up this CNAME, which is stored in a private DNS zone that is linked to the VNet that it resides in. And it gets a response that the IP address for azsql1.privatelink.database.windows.net is 10.5.0.5, which is the IP address of the private link endpoint. And that is then returned all the way through the chain down to the client VM. And the client VM can then go ahead and connect to the private endpoint using its private IP. And this setup works just fine. It's just that it's a small pain that you now have to have a VM in Azure that you need to maintain by patching, backing up, making sure you have disaster recovery, and so on. And especially if you are trying to go down the road of not having to have servers at all, then this is kind of a pain. Enter Private Resolver. So to put it as simply as possible, the Private Resolver is just the, it's basically the VM here as a service. That is a major simplification, of course, but that is the essence of it. The Private Resolver consists of two major parts, of which only one is actually required. It's the inbound endpoint and the outbound endpoint. The outbound endpoint is not a requirement, but it can be quite useful. I'll get back to it in just a minute. And additionally, you have to have the option to specify some forwarding rule sets, but we'll cover those when we get to the outbound endpoint as well. The endpoints, both inbound and outbound, can be compared to the network card of the VM in our first setup here. The inbound endpoint is, it will be where DNS queries should be forwarded to. So back to our first setup, it would be where the conditional forwarder should point. Again, it will take the place of that VM. All communication from the on-prem DNS will then be with the inbound endpoint. And this is really all you need for that first setup of ours. But say you have some spokes in your Azure environment as well. VNets where you have services that need to resolve DNS entries that lie on-prem and DNS entries for private endpoints. At first, you might think that, well, maybe you should just configure those spokes to use the on-prem DNS server. And while that would work, it would complicate your traffic flow and quite possibly introduce a bit of latency in DNS resolving as well, seeing as any DNS queries for private endpoints would then be first go down to that on-prem environment, then to be sent up to the private resolver and the answer sent back the same way. This is where you would make use of the outbound endpoint for your private resolver, because the outbound endpoint is from where the private resolver will do its own DNS queries, albeit only for those you specify, not all queries. You also need to set up a DNS forwarding rule set for this to work. So what you would do is to set up your spokes to use the inbound endpoint of your private resolver as their DNS server. Then you would set up a DNS forwarding rule set that specify that any queries for on-prem records should be forwarded through the outbound endpoint of the private resolver and to the on-prem DNS server. This would mean that any DNS queries for private endpoints originating in Azure will stay in Azure, and any DNS queries for on-prem records originating in Azure will be sent down to the on-prem DNS server. Neat, huh? Now, that's a whole lot of theory. Let us see how all this would work in practice. But before that, I would, of course, appreciate a like and subscribe if you're finding this content worthy of that at all. So, I do have prepared a demo environment that looks a bit like this as of now. We have a VNet in Azure that will act as our on-prem environment, with a VM functioning as a DNS server. Also, we have a hub VNet complete with Bastion so that we can connect to our VMs. And lastly, we have this VNet here that will represent our spoke, and it contains both a storage account with private endpoint and a VM that we will use to do some DNS queries. And since I promised to show you how to set this all up, this is all based on Bicep templates that I have made and made available to you over on my GitHub page. So link is, of course, down in the description. So to set up this environment, you would clone the repo or download these files, create a resource group for it in Azure, and then run this, basically this one command here, the new AZ resource group, call it a name, point to the resource group name, the template file, and select the stage. There is also an option that covers the complete setup, but for the sake of this video, we will do it manually in the portal. And by complete setup, I mean having the private resolver all in place. So, and by the way, if you want to see me create these sort of Bicep things live, you can do so over on my Twitch channel, twitch.tv/PetterTech. Link is always in the description of my videos. Now, to start this out, let us first verify that DNS works as intended as of now. So let's head on over to our portal and let's grab the DNS name of our storage account. So let us grab this name here, and then we need to connect to our VMs. So first, let us do the Spoke VM, connect via Bastion. And just let me grab the password really quick. Like so, and hit connect. We'll allow the clipboard and go back and also connect to our on-prem VM. Also through Bastion, of course. All right. Now that we have connected to our VMs, let us first take a look at the Spoke VM and see if we can resolve the name of our storage account from the Azure VM. It should then point to the private link version of that DNS name and eventually give us a private IP. So let's do resolve DNS name and paste in the storage account name. This would be .file.core.windows.net. And you see that this resolves to a private IP. Then let us do the same from our on-prem VM, which should then resolve to the public IP of our storage account instead. So let me just copy this command here and open up PowerShell, paste it in and run. And you see that this returns a public IP. Now, let us set up our private resolver and see if that makes things better. So back to the portal, and in my resource group, I'll hit create. I'll search for private resolver, and the DNS private resolver, hit create, and DNS private resolver. Call it a name, so let us call it just private resolver. Region is fine. Virtual network, this would be the hub network in our setup now. Select that, then do inbound endpoints, add an endpoint, and let's just call this inbound, and select the inbound subnet for now. We will do a static IP address for this inbound endpoint so that it doesn't change on us. So static, and then do 10.200.0.70, then hit save. And this is actually all we need for now. So we'll hit review and create, and then hit create. Alrighty, now that we have our private resolver, we can take a look at it and see that it has one inbound endpoint, which has the IP address of 10.200.0.70. So now that we have our private resolver, we need to configure our on-prem DNS with a conditional forwarder so that any DNS queries for Azure files goes to that private resolver. So let us go to our on-prem VM, open up the DNS management tool, and then go to conditional forwarders and right click and new conditional forwarder. The DNS domain for this would then be file.core.windows.net, and the IP address, that would be the IP address of the inbound endpoint of our private resolver, meaning in our case 10.200.0.70. Okay, then just hit OK. And now if we go back to PowerShell and do another attempt at resolving the storage account's name, you can see that we get now the private IP of our storage account, the IP address, private IP address of the private endpoints. Neat, huh? Also notice that it still returns the private link version of the name for the storage account. But since I configured a conditional forwarder for file.core.windows.net, it covers both the public and the private version of those names. So that is why this now is actually working. And yeah, it's all fine and done, yay. So now for the next part of the demo. Say you need to resolve on-prem records from Azure. Well, in our demo environment here, we can resolve the name of on-prem host.labzone.local from our on-prem VM. See, this returns a private IP of on-prem host.labzone.local. But if we try to do the same from our Azure VM or the spoke VM, let's give it a go. That will fail because the DNS name does not exist. That's just the error message you get when the DNS server cannot resolve that name. So let us set up the outbound endpoint and the DNS forwarding rule set so that we can. Now, going back to our private resolver in Azure, we can click on outbound endpoints and let's add an outbound endpoint, call just simply outbound. Select our outbound subnet and hit save. And now that we have our outbound endpoint, we also need to create a DNS forwarding rule set and tie that to this outbound endpoint as well. So let us go to our resource group and then hit create. And this time we will search for DNS forwarding rule set. There we are. And select create DNS forwarding rule set. And then we give it a fine and dandy name. So I'll just call it rule set for now. And the private resolver would be our private resolver. The outbound endpoint, well, let's use outbound. Now for rules, we can add a rule and call this for our lab zone, since we had that DNS zone called labzone.local. And the domain name would be labzone.local. It needs to end in a trailing dot. Rule set enabled, that's perfectly fine. Destination would be the private IP of our on-prem DNS server. So in our case, that would be 10.100.0.5. And the destination port needs to be port 53. That's just a hard-coded setting. So we now have the rule that should forward every lookup of labzone.local DNS entries and forward that to our on-prem DNS server. Next, and then here on virtual network links, we need to add in our hub VNet so that this applies to every DNS query in that VNet. So select the hub VNet and then hit add, then go to review and create, and then hit create. Now that we have our rule set deployed, it's one more thing that we need to change. And if we go back to our resource group, we need to make sure that our spoke VNet is set up to use the correct DNS servers. So if you see now, they are set up to use the default Azure provided ones, but we need to point this as well to the inbound endpoint of our private resolver. So in our case, that will be 10.200.0.70. And then hit save. And the documentation states that you need to now reboot your VMs for this to take effect. But I have found that usually a ipconfig/renew usually works as well. So let's just try that now. And then we can try to resolve our on-prem DNS entry once again. And voila, it now works. So now we can resolve on-prem DNS entries from our Azure side of things, and we can resolve private endpoint addresses from our on-prem environment as well. That's not half bad. All good. If you just want to have this complete setup as I've completed it now, you do have the options to do so in the Bicep files that I referenced earlier. Instead of just doing the first stage, you could then go ahead and do end stage instead, and then just run the deployment like that. That would net you pretty much the same exact environment that I have ended up with now. Now, multiple times throughout the video, I have mentioned private endpoints, and if you would like to know more about that service, I do have a video on it that you can watch right here. Also, I really want to know if these kinds of videos where I, create lab environments for you to follow along to is something I should invest more time in. So let me know in the comments if you like this type of video. As always, like and subscribe, and yeah, cheers.